tech giants getting dangerously big and powerful. We meet the man who wants to cut them down to size. And in Swamp Watch tonight, the Google boss who crushed a critic. We expose how big tech's big money turns think tanks and professors into corporate stooges. Evening, everyone. Welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. The big news today: growing protests in sport and beyond following the president's remarks about NFL players taking a knee at his rally in Alabama on Friday night. With a roundup of the day's events, let's go now to Fox News correspondent Marianne Rafferty, who's outside the LA Chargers stadium.
Well, Steve, several NFL teams decided to stay in the locker room during the national anthem rather than deal with the controversy. The protest started early during the first game of the day, the Jaguars-Ravens game held in London, with players on both teams taking a knee. More than 100 players at games held across the U.S. also kneeling. The intense controversy began with a speech by President Trump at a political rally in Alabama, where he said those players who take a knee should be fired.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a off the field right now, out, he's fired.
And today, President Trump doubling down on those comments.
I think it's very disrespectful to our flag and to our country. So I certainly think the owners should do something about it. There was great solidarity. I watched a little bit. I was not watching the games today, believe me, I'm doing other things. But I watched a little bit, and I will say that there was tremendous solidarity for our flag and for our country.
But owners showing support for their players' right to protest. The Texans founder, for example, releasing a statement reading in part, the comments made by the president were divisive and counterproductive to what our country needs right now. And fans have mixed reactions.
Trump's our president, like it or not, and I feel that they should go out for the national anthem. I'm an American, so whether I agree with him or not, I feel as an American and a fan that you should be out there for the national anthem and you should stand proud.
I voted for Trump, and I'm a big Trump supporter. I mean, I could have been happier when he got elected, but I think with what he's doing now, it's crossing the line. It's getting a little too personal.
Either way, the fans say the controversy will not keep them from coming to games or watching the game they love on TV. Steve?
Thanks, Marianne. And tonight, the protests are spreading beyond sports. We saw legendary singer Stevie Wonder taking a knee at a concert in New York. And the entire cast of the Broadway play 1984 took a knee at tonight's curtain call. To discuss, I'm joined now by Fox News contributor and nationally syndicated radio host Richard Fowler, and Fox News contributor and the host of the David Webb Show on Sirius XM, Patriot David Webb. Richard, I just want to start with you. This all began as a protest against racial injustice, something which I think most people, certainly me, would agree is an incredibly important cause to fight for. Do you think that's still what it is at the end of this weekend?
Absolutely. I think it started almost 2 years ago now by Colin Kaepernick, a quarterback for the 49ers, who said there's too much racial injustice in this country. We've got to use this moment to say, we've got to stand up, and how else to do it but he used his platform to sit during the national anthem as a speech act to say there's too much racism, we've got to correct it. And now Donald Trump has stepped his foot into this, and now players all across the league, players and NFL players, NHL players, NBA players are all saying this is enough, we've had enough. And let me be very clear, the president's words in Alabama a couple of days ago are disheartening. He called NFL players who protested injustice, he called their mothers the B word. That's atrocious for the president of the United States, who should be a role model to children everywhere. And so before people will defend this president, but that's undefensible for a president of the United States to make such a comment.
It's also false.
Partly,
that's exactly what.
David, just before hang on a second, David. We'll get to you in a second. I just wanted to go back to Richard just very briefly, which is precisely because of the point that you just made. It feels to me like this actually has turned into a generalized political protest against Donald Trump.
Well, I think that the president is trying to make this about the flag, and I think this is a smokescreen because he's doing horribly and he can't pass a health care bill. But now he's waded into a larger problem in this country, which is institutional racism and racism at the hands of police departments throughout the country, including in St. Louis, which we've seen protests go on now for numbers of weeks, and he's not chosen to address it. He's also not chosen to address the fact that 100% of the people in Puerto Rico don't have power. But now he wants to wade into the NFL.
David, do you think that those protesting today have a point grounded in legitimate complaint of some kind?
Of course they have a point as they see it, and they have a legitimate point as they see it, and they have a right to exercise that. So rights and responsibilities matter here. And by the way, Richard unpacked, as he usually does, a plethora of things that actually don't always belong in the conversation. For instance, bringing in the players' mothers to it. So, Richard...
Well, the president brought in the players' mothers. Let's be very clear.
If I could finish, Richard, rather than be interrupted.
Richard, let David finish.
I didn't interrupt you. Let me finish.
You interrupted me.
Okay, let's not go through that. David, your go.
All right. So, the president made a statement. By the way, Donald Trump still has the right to his free speech and his opinion. He can't fire anyone. Neither can anyone from the outside call in for someone else to be fired, as they did with ESPN. So let's put that fact on the table. This has become more political against the right because the left needs an argument. They need a boogeyman. Colin Kaepernick, who put himself in that spotlight, didn't honor the troops. And I'm wearing two pins, and I want to bring them up for a reason that goes to this argument. One is my dad's flag pin, 2 tours in Vietnam. I still have it after he died. Second is what the NFL used to stand for. It's support the troops. Instead of kneeling and supporting those who actually wear a uniform to defend, rather standing to support those who wear a uniform to defend their right to free speech, these elitists who make millions of dollars have decided not to do anything about the issues of racial injustice as they see it. Colin Kaepernick has done basically nothing organizationally in the last 2 years except fail out of football. And the others who follow along, rather than having a contextual discussion on the issues of race, go along with things like what Richard just said about institutional racism. Well, in order for institutional racism to exist in the United States, if I could just finish this, in order for such a thing to exist, you have to have codified law and social acceptance. Neither exists in the United States today when it comes to racism. There are outliers in this, and we can deal with that.
I don't think that's right. Honestly, I hear you. I hear that point made, but that doesn't ring true to me. Just one point that we've made on this show repeatedly. Look, in this show we focus a lot on the whole populist movement and particularly the economic aspects of that. And we talk all the time about the fact that incomes have been stagnating in America for many, many years now, decades in fact. And we showed the data that showed that even whilst that's been going on, at every single level of income, black people earn less than white people. So I don't know how you can say that that's not an issue. My question finally to Richard is this. Do you think, hang on a second, I just want to put a final question to Richard before we move on, just specifically on the serious argument here about racial injustice. Would you accept that actually there are better ways to advance that cause than to do so in a way that causes such offense to so many Americans who see this action against something they love, the national flag and the anthem, and just think, you know what, I'm not even going to listen to your points because I just hate the way you're going about it. Isn't there a better way to make these arguments?
Oh, I think that's a very valid question, Stephen. Let me answer that by saying this. To all of our veterans out there, I appreciate you and I appreciate your service. And I want to say this: I don't think there's any of the NFL players, and I know some of them very well, that are trying to disrespect vets by protesting, by sitting during the national anthem. What they're saying is this: you fight for our right to be Americans. You fight for our right to protest. And because you fight for our right, we're using that right to fight against injustice, and we're using that right to fight against policies and practices, and excuse me, I did not interrupt you. Policies and practices of bias and bigotry that are happening all across the country. They're happening in police departments, they're happening in education systems, they're happening in city halls and state capitals all across this country, and that is what we're fighting.
I'm really sorry, guys.
Thank you, Steve.
I'm really sorry, guys. There was a lot of really important points you both made.
They're not. They're actually false.
But I've got some people here who have got really important and interesting points to make.
Steve.
And I want to bring in our panel right here in Los Angeles. Thank you to both of you, but with me here tonight, New York Times best-selling author Vicky Ward, Fox News contributor and co-author of End of Discussion, Guy Benson, and associate editor and columnist at Real Clear Politics, A.B. Stoddard. A.B., I want to start with you. You saw that discussion there. There are really, really serious issues at the heart of this. I worry that it's all just got muddled up in a kind of we hate Donald Trump kind of response. And we're not even going to get to talking about
that's a good point. I'm in the lonely middle on this. I'm of two minds. I really, truly believe that as an American, I want everyone to unify behind our anthem and our flag. I want at those events us to not be feeling red or blue state or tribal, but to be feeling unified together. So it's sad to see all of this division. But I'm opposed to presidents of the United States calling for boycotts. And Donald Trump's freedom of speech, which is being exercised by these protesters, is a protected American right. Last night on Twitter, he threatened nuclear war. I think it's one of the most reckless things, probably the most reckless thing he's done in office. It is his right to do that, even as dangerous as I find it. And so when these people sit down on their knee, they're not giving the finger, they're not, you know, it's upsetting, but it is not a right we're going to take away.
Guy.
I mean, it's disrespectful, and it makes a lot of people upset. And I agree with much of what you said early on in your answer there, A.B., about this is a right and Trump going too far and calling for firings and boycotts. I don't support that. But one of the things here that I am most sad about is the politicizing of every aspect of American life. Politics should not be our constant obsession or national religion. Politics is part of what we do in this country, and as it seeps into everything else like sports, which is a respite, a uniting respite from politics and other hardships of life, that to me as a sports fan is really depressing. The last point I'll make on this, I want to give a shout out to Pittsburgh Steelers offensive lineman Alejandro Villanueva today. His entire team decided to sit in the locker room and not participate in the anthem at all. He's a Bronze Star recipient, 3 tours in Afghanistan, Army Ranger, and he said, screw that. And he went out on the field, hand on heart, and his coach criticized him for it, which is beyond me. It blows my mind, but good for him.
The fact that he did it, I didn't hear that part. That's incredibly brave. You're quite right. Vicky, I just wanted to you're a Brit like me.
Well, actually, I became American.
There you are. Well, this leads me to the point.
By the way, Philadelphia Eagles fan.
Well, originally a Brit, but you can really speak to this point, because one of the things that I love about America is the fact that patriotism isn't something that's kind of uncool and to be embarrassed about. Whereas I found for a lot of people that was the case in the UK, that people generally don't stand for the anthem in any context. You know, displaying the flag is kind of culturally seen as not that cool. It's something that just older people do. So that patriotism is kind of embarrassing in the UK, whereas in America it's always being this thing that everyone participates in. I think it would be tragic if that fell apart.
I feel when I go to Eagles games and you know, the flag comes down, and particularly since July when I became American, I mean, it's a very special moment. However, I am going to agree completely with A.B. On this topic, and I think that the president's language, Steve, is so unfortunate. Calling members of the NFL SOBs, those people, I mean, it's so divisive. He has lowered this debate.
There's a reasonable argument to say that actually the divisiveness is, I was like the point I was making to Richard, you know, there are good points here from those who initiated these protests, but isn't it divisive to go after the thing that is literally supposed to bring the country together, the flag and the anthem? That's divisive,
and it's hurting the cause, and it's spun off into something else. And I'll make this out. You talk a lot about the disconnect between the media and the people in this country. The disconnect between the sports media and sports fans in America is just as deep as we've experienced in politics. I guarantee you that Donald Trump has a lot more support from a lot more sports fans than the folks at ESPN and sports columnists across the country.
Okay, Vicky, quick last word to you, because we got to go.
I mean, I hear what you say, but I also think that the whole point of protest is to do it in a forum like this, when everybody is watching and stirring debate.
Well,
They have the right to do it.
We covered as much as we're going to get through. I don't think it's the end of this conversation. We've got a lot more to get to tonight because it's a really big week coming up. And later tonight, we will debate the power of the tech giants. Is it time to break them up? But next, a huge week in politics coming up. Will it be the end of healthcare reform, but the start of tax reform? We'll break it down for you right ahead. Welcome back to the next revolution. All right, two massive issues on the agenda next week. We're expecting a vote on the latest Republican attempt to repeal and replace Obamacare. And then on Wednesday, President Trump will set out his plan for tax reform. What does it all mean for the populist revolution that people voted for last November? Let's start with the healthcare situation. It's been evolving over the weekend, almost hourly. What do you make of where we are now and what's going to happen?
There's a final negotiation going on between Senator Rand Paul, who was opposed from the beginning. He basically said it's still too much Obamacare. And he's asking for them to dismantle it further in a way that's impossible to pass, because then you'll have moderate Republicans drop off. And so this law is unrepealable by this Republican body in the Congress and the House and the Senate, but they never want to admit that. So they continue to stumble through these exercises. They can only fix it, but they cannot repeal it.
So basically, you think that even if they have a vote, they're not going to get it? It's not going to pass this week.
I don't think a repeal could pass.
Okay.
Something that they could call a fix.
That's my sense. But
it's the makeup of the Senate Republicans, the voters that put Trump in office. That whole debate has changed.
In my view, all along, I've said it, week after week on this show, is that they shouldn't have started with this. They shouldn't have got bogged down in it. The reason that President Trump was elected was to get the economy moving. He should have started with the economic agenda, including tax reform and infrastructure. What do we make of that? What do you expect?
It was a 7-year promise. Exactly. And they won 3 out of 4 elections on this central promise. And he repeated it.
President Trump...
No, he said it over and over again.
He said it day one.
Right, he did, day one. So the other point I would make about how the Republicans might be able to emerge from this quagmire, Susan Collins from Maine, a moderate, has been one of the most intransigent Republicans in this whole process. No, no, no on everything. She actually has an Obamacare replacement bill that she put out with Senator Cassidy, who's teamed up with Lindsey Graham. I would like to know if Susan Collins would vote for her own bill on Obamacare replacement. It's further to the center than the other plans, but Republicans are desperate at this point. I think it'd be interesting for the president and Mitch McConnell to go to Susan Collins and say, let's look at your bill. Is that a place to start?
Not another one. Haven't we had enough of this? The thing that, just before we go to that, look, the thing I liked finally about, I didn't like the previous bills because it felt to me that they were a contradiction of what the president ran on in terms of a populist agenda on health. This one at least felt true to that in the sense that it was decentralizing power, putting power back in the hands of people. I want to just get to tax. So you live in New York.
Yeah.
All those rich people in New York, are they going to be getting all the Wall Street people? President Trump says there's no tax cut for them. Is this going to be a populist tax reform?
Oh, I don't believe that, Steve, for a second. Has President Trump started talking about tax reform for real estate developers? I don't think so. I wrote a book all about New York's real estate developers, and people like the president managed to pay absolutely zero taxes, because we don't know what he's paid in taxes because we haven't seen his tax.
That the rich people won't get anything out of this.
Well, he's said a lot of things, hasn't he, Steve? We're going to see, it's not going to be a tax reform next week, it's going to be a tax cut, and it's certainly not going to be for people like him.
How should we judge it? Is it if we want to say, like, they're going to publish their plan on Wednesday, the big 6 who've been working on it in Congress, the president's going to launch it, how will we know whether it's populist or not?
If you're going to cut taxes across the board, rich people pay a disproportionate percentage of taxes. The top 1% pay 40% of the income tax at the federal level, so they are going to get a break. However, on the populist side, will there be a middle-class tax cut?
Yep.
I think there will be. And the key for Republicans, I think, to really emphasize is simplification, simplifying the tax code and making it much easier for people to file their taxes. That has major populist appeal, and that is part of reform that goes beyond just cuts. So
my view is that the big thing that we need to look out for is what's going to really boost the economy so we get growth rates up, because the real issue that the populist movement's built around is this stagnating income. So we need the boost to economic growth, and that comes actually from the corporate tax cut and the repatriation of money that's held overseas by all these giant companies. Don't you think that corporate tax cut, we were told today it might be 20%. I think that 15% is what's needed to make America competitive.
The Republicans have been saying for months quietly it's going to only be at 25. If they get to 20, it'll be a miracle.
Oh my gosh.
And the thing is, the effective rate is 25. So how much of a jolt it actually gives the economy, since the corporate rate really isn't truly 35 right now, we don't know.
Wow.
They're promising, double the standard deduction, things for middle class taxpayers, but what comes out on Wednesday, Steve, and what ends up going to the floor after the moneyed interests come and savage it?
Well, that is the big question with all of this, but
their loopholes is we don't know where we're going to end up.
Well, that's certainly true. I'm afraid we're out of time on those two big topics. But coming up later in Swamp Watch tonight, we will expose how Google and the other tech firms use their money to buy up think tanks and academics. But straight after the break, are the tech giants a threat to our democracy? Our next guest says it's time to take them on. Welcome back, everyone. In a moment, we'll talk to author Jonathan Taplin, who believes it's time to stop the tech giants in their tracks before they completely destroy our culture and democracy. But first, our own Anita Vogel explains how Silicon Valley became the place that everyone loves to hate.
Google. You got us a job at Google?
In 2013, the movie The Internship portrayed Google as an idyllic place to work.
We have cameras in place all over the world right now.
Just 4 years later, the film The Circle gave us a more sinister take on a future Google Facebook-like company that eliminates privacy in favor of ultimate surveillance. So how exactly did big tech go from darlings to demons?
The trust factor is rapidly eroding. Can't always believe what we hear and see on some of these sites, and we have questions about the way in which they track us, and we have questions about privacy, and we have questions about whether they're just too big and wield too much power.
Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft are the 5 big companies that make up big tech, and today they own the market. Consider, in 2004, Google's market share was just 35%. Today, under parent company Alphabet, it's 87% in the U.S.
I think they are creating some sort of a domination of only one source to go to. So nobody thinks about searching at Yahoo anymore. Everybody thinks about only Google.
UCLA finance professor Bhagwan Chowdhury wonders, with that kind of market power, who can compete?
When Google collects all this data on us, it gives them a big advantage. When Amazon knows our spending patterns, it knows where we buy and how much we buy and what our incomes are, it gives them an advantage.
Speaking of Amazon, in 2004, it had a net sales revenue of $6.9 billion. In 2016, it grew to nearly $136 billion. When it comes to mobile social networks, Facebook and its subsidiaries lead the pack.
We've never had this before. It used to be, had a big railroad company or a big steel company, but these are companies that have their tentacles into almost every aspect of our lives.
As for too big to fail, experts say no one is invincible.
MySpace, do you remember MySpace? Well, MySpace was, at some point it had 100 million users, and everybody thought, oh, they're going to capture a good size of the market, and pretty soon after that, Facebook took over.
And with revelations of selling ads to the Russians and concerns over data safety, it's no surprise big tech is on the defense. In Los Angeles, Anita Vogel for The Next Revolution.
Thank you, Anita. According to my next guest, the fact that more and more Americans get their news, music and entertainment from just a few massive tech companies poses a real threat to democracy. He is Jonathan Taplin, Director Emeritus at the Annenberg Innovation Lab at USC and author of Move Fast and Break Things, How Facebook, Google and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. But before we get into this subject, I should say that we reached out to Google and Facebook to participate in our program, but they didn't want to do that. And also, in the spirit of full disclosure, you should know that my wife was once a senior PR executive at Google and is now at Facebook. So you can see what kind of night I'm going to have when I get home. Guess I'll be sleeping on the couch. Jonathan, we've seen there some of the, if you like, the case against the tech giants. The thing that you hear over and over again in this conversation about what we should do about it are two things. One is they're basically utilities now, and they should be regulated like utilities. And the other thing you hear is, well, they're too big and they should be broken up. But I've never understood what's meant by either of those. Can you illuminate?
Yeah, I mean, the utility argument goes back to when AT&T was the monopoly phone company in America in 1956. And the government sued them under the antitrust laws and said, basically, you have to surrender all of your IP, your intellectual property, to anybody. You have to license it for free to any other company from Bell Labs in order to stay a monopoly. So what happened was they happened to have the transistor, the laser, the semiconductor, the satellite, basically all the basic parts of the digital economy. And they licensed it for free, and that created Texas Instruments, Motorola, Intel, Fairchild Semiconductor, ComSat.
So what's the parallel today? What would you like to see done about...
Look, I think the first step is Google could license all its intellectual property. Instead of suing Uber or other companies over autonomous car patents, maybe they should have to give away their search patents, their autonomous car patents, their Nest patents, all the other tens of thousands of patents. But I think there's
is that a version of what people say when they say regulate them like a utility?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that's one way to look at it. There's other simpler ways to go about this. I mean, your package mentioned the Facebook ad thing. Why shouldn't Facebook and Google have to disclose who bought the ads, the dark post ads on their services? That's what you have to do on TV. When someone puts an ad, a political ad on Fox, they have to say who paid for it. You never have to say that.
So that gets into the sort of Russia election argument, but it doesn't really get to the dominance, does it?
Okay. So on the dominance argument, there's one really clear thing that might need to happen, which is maybe these companies have to be split up. So Facebook, we have to remember all these companies grew by acquisition. Google bought YouTube, Google bought AdMob, Google bought DoubleClick, Google bought many, many companies. Facebook bought Instagram, Facebook bought WhatsApp. So maybe those companies have to be split again so they can compete against each other. And you have multiple places, because if I'm trying to put propaganda, if I had to figure out 10 companies instead of 2, maybe it would be harder.
Okay, well, it's an interesting point of view, and it's interesting to me how this argument is gathering steam. We'll have a chance to talk about it later on with the panel. But coming up next, Swamp Watch takes on Silicon Valley. We'll show you what happened when the boss of a tech giant was displeased by the work of a think tank he funded. No industry wields greater influence than the tech sector. Apple, Google, Amazon and Facebook are in some ways more powerful than our federal government. The tech giants decide what information we see and what we don't. Their decisions can close down whole industries, and their powerful bosses are now getting involved in politics directly. For many years they stuck to sunny California, but today they're a huge presence in the Washington swamp, spending millions to make sure legislation goes their way, providing a lucrative revolving door, or should we say portal, between industry and government. And they're even secretly funding lapdog professors to make their arguments for them. Big Tech is tonight's Swamp Watch. In June, European Union antitrust regulators hit Google with a $2.7 billion fine for skewing search results in favor of its own services like shopping and travel, and against its competitors. Immediately after the announcement, US antitrust expert Barry Lin posted a short memo online celebrating the verdict and calling on the US to do the same, writing, "Google's market power is one of the most critical challenges for competition policymakers in the world today. We call upon US enforcers, including the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice and state attorneys general, to build upon this important precedent." It's the kind of response you'd expect, considering Lin's own Open Markets Initiative has been investigating the abuse of market power in the telecoms and tech industries since 2002. But this time, there was a problem. Barry Lin's initiative was operating as part of the Washington, D.C. think tank New America Foundation, which has received more than $21 million from Google, its executive chairman Eric Schmidt, and his family's foundation. Schmidt did not appreciate the memo, and hell hath no fury, like a tech leader scorned. A few days later, Anne-Marie Slaughter, the New America think tank's president, and, by the way, a former top aide to Hillary Clinton in the State Department, summoned Lin to her office to berate him for upsetting one of New America's biggest donors. She later told Lin in an email, Just think about how you are imperiling funding for others, and that we are in the process of trying to expand our relationship with Google on some absolutely key points. Don't you love the way these swampy people slime around in euphemisms to avoid admitting their own money-grubbing ways, trying to expand our relationship with Google? Indeed, she means we're trying to get more money out of Google so we can't go around criticizing them. Sure enough, a few days later, she sent another email saying, "The time has come for open markets and New America to part ways." Ms. Slaughter says that Lim was terminated because he refused to, quote, "adhere to New America's standards of openness and institutional collegiality." Oh, for goodness sake, why can't this swamp creature ever be straight with people? Wait, we know why. She learned at the feet of the master, hanging out with Hillary at the State Department while she exploited her public office to channel cash into the swampy Clinton Foundation. Meanwhile, Barry Lynn says he was axed, obviously, because he dared to criticize New America's financial backer. He added, "Google is very aggressive in throwing its money around Washington and Brussels and then pulling the strings. People are so afraid of Google now." He's right. Google and its parent company, Alphabet, have steadily increased what they spend on lobbying. In 2002, they spent just $50,000 on lobbying. In 2016, they spent $15.5 million. And so far this year, they've already spent $9.5 million. Influence is not just money, of course. As in so many other sectors, in tech, there is now a well-oiled revolving door between government and business. Literally hundreds of people have spun through the revolving door between Google and the federal government, including America's former chief technology officer, multiple deputies, and the assistant director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But all this access to the levers of power is so much more effective if you have objective scientific data to back up your arguments. And if it doesn't actually exist, well, you can just pay for it. That's why, over the past decade, Google has financed hundreds of academic papers, paying professors between $500,000 and $400,000 apiece. A Wall Street Journal investigation found that, scandalously, some of the academics did not disclose Google's backing. Others shared their research with the company prior to publication. Devon Desai, then a researcher in law and technology at Princeton, spent over $2 million of Google's money on conferences and research papers, paying authors between $20,000 to $150,000 for their work on issues like intellectual property. He said part of his work was to put together lists of the top intellectual property academics so Google's lobbyists would know who to target. Then, in September 2012, the Federal Trade Commission was preparing to decide on whether to charge Google with antitrust violations, the biggest antitrust investigation since the landmark case against Microsoft in the 90s. To ward off an unfavorable decision, Google's law firm sent the FTC chairman a letter and attached those Google-funded, supposedly independent research papers in support of its arguments. They obviously did the trick. Google pledged to change its business practices and didn't face a fine. I guess it helps to have some of the nation's top academics in your pocket. To be fair to Google, all this really shows is that they've grown from a quirky startup whose motto was "Don't be evil" into a massive global corporation just like all the others. They compete in a swamp where propaganda like industry-funded research papers is now the norm. Microsoft, which owns the far less popular search engine Bing, paid Harvard business professor Ben Edelman, who criticized Google search for being biased in favor of its own results. And tech and telecom companies, Verizon, AT&T and Qualcomm, have all funded academic papers supporting their side in various fights with Google. Make no mistake, industry-funded research from top academics delivers business results. In fact, a well-crafted argument backed by hard data is probably even more effective than political donations. Many congressional staffers and regulators in Washington are young, underpaid, and simply don't have the knowledge, expertise, or even the time to push back. The transformation of academics and think tanks into corporate stooges is one of the most insidious and underreported scandals in the DC swamp, and you can be sure that we will be back to expose the industries, the companies, the think tanks, and the professors who participate in this particularly elevated form of corruption. Coming up, the panel and Jonathan Taplin weigh in. Don't go away. We're back with Jonathan and the panel. I want to start with you, Vicky. There's a whole menu of tech topics for you to get stuck into. Take your pick.
Facebook, because I think it's the one that we're all thinking about right now. Because
very helpful, since my wife's right there now. Why'd you have to start with them?
Sorry, Rachel. Yes, no. So, as we know, the last 2 weeks we've seen suddenly they found, you know, what was it, 3,000 ads from Russian troll farms. They've also found targeted anti-Semitic advertising. Sheryl Sandberg's come out, you know, apologized for that. But I think it feels terribly stage managed, all on their own terms. I've been looking into this for months and months. I wrote a big deep dive for the Huffington Post Highlight magazine on the Mercers and the Trump campaign, and Conservatives in that campaign kept saying to me, why have you not found this woman, Katie Harbath, Facebook's representative on the Trump campaign? I have sent Katie Harbath numerous emails, numerous phone calls. Wait a minute, what do you mean Facebook's representative on the Trump campaign? So Facebook asked both the Clinton campaign and the Trump campaign if they would like to have representatives sitting in. The Clinton campaign said no. The Trump campaign said yes, they would like. Katie Harbath sat in. She was there. These advertising came on her watch. I think we would all like to hear from Katie Harbath.
Well, maybe. Have you heard about this?
Well, yeah. I mean, here's the thing. These are what we call dark posts. So they were aimed at dark post means an ad that only goes to a certain number of people that would not surface for most people's blind. So if, for instance, I wanted to do voter suppression, which they did a lot, I would send ads to young African Americans saying, Hillary Clinton says young African Americans are super predators. Only young African Americans would see that ad. And Cambridge Analytica, which was the firm that Steve Bannon ran before he became the president of the Trump campaign, worked with this Katie to target unbelievably tightly, and they spent $75 million on Facebook ads. So they probably got 75 million ads, maybe 200 million.
Okay, look, I want to broaden it from the. I mean, that very interesting point you raised.
I think, you know, they should come out of the shadows.
Okay, I think there's been a lot of focus recently on Facebook and the election. I want to broaden it out to this conversation about tech more broadly and its power and dominance. I mean, it's interesting to me that you've got the people on the right. It's almost become a mainstream position on the right that these tech firms should be confronted, broken up, regulated. What's going on?
Well, I think part of it's just it's frightening that a small number of companies really control so much of all of our access to information and have so much information about all of us. I mean, they could ruin my life tomorrow if they wanted to. Please don't. But we're a little bit afraid, right, of like what Facebook and Google knows about, you know, everything that we've done online, our online footprint. So I think that there's this juxtaposition, there's a tension, because on one side you have these concerns, there's real sense that Silicon Valley is very hostile to conservative values. We saw one of the big brouhaha over the firing of that engineer who wrote a memo. And then on the other side of it, what's the solution? Because if the solution is government regulation, who's to say Washington is going to do a good job of this?
AB, last word to you on this. What do you think the solution is?
I don't have the solution, and all of Jonathan's arguments and facts are compelling, the antitrust issues, all of this. The lagging indicators, the consumer, they're zombies. They're addicted to these companies, and they love these companies. This is magic to them. They're not concerned about their privacy. There's no consumer outrage, therefore no pressure, and therefore I think these people can save themselves.
Can I tell just a little story where this goes? In China, Alibaba is running something called Sesame Social Credit. The Chinese government wants everybody to get on the system. Now there's 200 million people on it. What it does is overlay your credit report with your social media activity. So if you, say, play video games for 5 hours a day, your social credit goes down. If you post something against the Chinese government, your social credit goes down. If you did jaywalk in Shanghai, your social credit would down.
It sounds frightening.
You would think people would be freaked out, but they're advertising their social credit score on their dating apps.
Well, I think that's the big point at the heart of this, which is people are doing all this voluntary. No one's making them do this. But great discussion. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thanks to all of you. And stay around. We've got one more thing to talk about on this busy news night. We're going to look ahead to Tuesday's Senate race in Alabama. That's right ahead. Welcome back, everyone. A look ahead to one of the biggest stories of next week, the Alabama Senate race, which has President Trump backing the establishment candidate Luther Strange and his former guru Steve Bannon backing the populist challenger Roy Moore. Guy, what's going on here?
I think Trump wants someone who's going to be reliable to vote for his agenda. I think Strange has done that and would do that in the future, as opposed to Roy Moore, who came out against Graham Cassidy, something that Trump was all in for. There's other things at play here. I think if you look at the polling, Moore is likely to win, but that gap has closed, and we'll see if the president's big campaign rally on Friday might be enough to make it too close to call. So I still think Moore probably wins.
So, AB, if Roy Moore wins, is this like a big demonstration of Steve Bannon's power, as he claims, now back at Breitbart?
That's what he'll say. What he and Sebastian Gorka and others are saying is that Trump, basically they're saying it with euphemisms, that Trump was tricked into backing Luther Strange, and that he doesn't really know better, and he's the toddler they have to take care of and manage. But this will be a victory for Trumpism. If Roy Moore, the candidate Trump is not backing,